War doesn't just take lives. It destroys what remains of those who survive. For Brian, the explosion that took his legs in the Middle East was just the beginning of his true hell. The smell of gunpowder and burnt flesh was still in his nostrils when he opened his eyes in the military hospital. The white ceiling and the machines around him didn't make sense at first. He tried to move, and then he realized something was wrong. Instinct made him try to get up, but when his body didn't respond as it should, panic set in. His heart raced. His breathing became shallow. He tried to move his legs, but they weren't there. No, this can't be happening. The doctors rushed over. One of them placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him. "Sergeant Brian, you're safe now." Safe? How could anyone be safe without their own legs? The voices around him became noise. His chest rose and fell too quickly. He wanted to scream, but the sound got stuck in his throat. The world began to spin. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the look of pity on the nurse's face beside his bed. Time in the hospital became a blur. Days and nights blended together. The same questions echoed in his mind without answers. What now? What am I without my legs? The doctors talked about adaptation. The psychologists insisted on acceptance. But they didn't understand. None of them knew what it was like to lose everything in an instant. His fellow soldiers came to visit. But their looks said more than their words. They tried to hide their shock when they saw him in that bed. But Brian noticed. He was no longer a soldier. He was no longer the man who entered that war. And for the first time, Brian wished the explosion had taken more than just his legs. Darkness became his only companion. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emptiness inside him. No matter how many times the doctors said he was lucky to be alive, he didn't want to be alive. The nurses kept trying to cheer him up. They talked about soldiers who had overcome their limitations, who had returned to their lives, who had reinvented themselves. But Brian saw no meaning in any of it. What could he do now? Who was he without his strength, without his position in the army? He refused to look at his own body. He avoided mirrors. When he finally gathered the courage to look down, the shock hit him like a punch to the gut. Where his muscular legs once were, now there were only stumps covered in bandages. Reality hit him hard. And for the first time since the explosion, Brian cried. He cried until he had no strength left. Days turned into weeks. Depression became his new war, and this time he had no weapons to fight. The doctors insisted he start physical therapy. They talked about prosthetics, about adaptation. But he refused. What was the point of trying? Nothing would change what had happened. Then, on an ordinary day, everything changed. He didn't know that day would be different. He didn't know that a simple encounter would change his life forever, and that a 10-year-old boy would say the words that would make Brian see a new path. The military hospital was a place of recovery, but to Brian, it felt more like a prison. Every day was the same. He would wake up, ignore the nurses, refuse physical therapy, and go back to sleep. He refused to accept his new reality, because accepting it meant admitting he would never be the same again. The doctors said he needed to start rehabilitation, that his mechanical legs were ready, waiting to be fitted to his body. But what difference would it make? What would he do with prosthetics? Go back to the battlefield? Run like before? The life he knew was over. So why bother trying? Silence became his only response. When soldiers came to visit, he pretended to be asleep. When psychologists tried to talk, he stayed silent. And when the nurses insisted he get out of bed, he simply turned his face to the wall. Brian didn't want help. He didn't want motivational advice. He wanted to disappear. Because deep down, the truth was cruel. He no longer saw a reason to keep living. Until, on an ordinary day, someone walked into his room unannounced. Brian expected to see a doctor, a nurse, or some soldier try and convince him to snap out of it. But instead, he saw a boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Small, skinny, wearing a worn-out hoodie and holding a notebook under his arm. Brian frowned. "Who let you in here?" The boy ignored the question and shrugged. "Were you a real soldier?" Brian let out a dry laugh. "I was." The boy nodded, looking around the room. "So, have you saved people?" Brian looked away toward the window. "I tried. The boy was silent for a moment. Then he said something that made Brian look at him for the first time. "I think you can still save people." Brian laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. "I can't even get out of this bed. How the hell am I supposed to save anyone?" The boy pointed to his own legs. "I can't run either. I had a tumor, and the doctors took part of my bone." Brian blinked, surprised. He hadn't noticed a slight tilt in the boy's posture or the scar hidden by the fabric of the hoodie. "But my dad told me that a hero isn't someone who fights when everything is fine, but someone who keeps fighting after they've lost everything." Silence filled the room. Brian felt something strange inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. That phrase kept echoing in his mind. Keeps fighting after they've lost everything. But he had already lost everything, right? So why were those words pounding in his mind so strongly? That night, Brian didn't sleep. The boy was gone, but his voice kept echoing in his head. A hero keeps fighting after they've lost everything. He didn't want to admit it, but there was something in that phrase that hurt more than any wound he'd ever had. Because deep down, Brian knew the truth. He had stopped fighting. The explosion didn't kill him, but it destroyed him inside. The war had marked him forever. But the battle that really mattered wasn't over yet, and he needed to decide. Either he kept sinking into the pain, or he started fighting again. Brian stayed awake all night. The boy's face wouldn't leave his mind. The phrase kept pounding in his head. A hero keeps fighting after they've lost everything. But how could he fight? He was no longer a soldier. He was no longer strong. He was no longer anything. Or at least that's what he believed. The next morning, the nurse entered the room as she did every day. She expected to see Brian the same way, silent, facing the wall, refusing any help. But to her surprise, that day he was sitting up. "I want to try physical therapy." The woman blinked, surprised. "You want to?" Brian nodded. "I do." And for the first time since the explosion, he realized something. He still had a choice. He could keep sinking into pain or try to get up. Physical therapy was worse than he imagined. His muscles were weak. His balance was non-existent. Every movement felt like punishment. The prosthetics were fitted to his body, but they felt alien. He tried to take the first step and fell. He tried again and fell again. With every fall, the voice in his head screamed, "Give up. You'll never be the same. It's better to accept defeat." But now there was another voice inside him. A small voice, but a strong one. The voice of a 10-year-old. "Boy, a hero keeps fighting after they've lost everything." And so Brian tried again, and again, and again. Days passed. The falls continued, but something changed. This time, he got up faster. With every physical therapy session, he could take one more step. And then, after weeks of pain and frustration, something that seemed impossible happened. He managed to walk to the other side of the room. The physical therapist clapped. The nurse smiled. But Brian could only think of one thing. I can still fight. That night, he took a piece of paper and a pen. And for the first time since the explosion, he wrote down a goal. I want to run again. He still didn't know how. He didn't know if it was possible. But he knew he couldn't stop now. He had already lost everything once. Now he only had one choice. To keep fighting. Brian woke up feeling pain all over his body. Physical therapy was exhausting. Every muscle seemed to be rebelling against him. But for the first time in months, the pain had a purpose. He looked at the paper beside the bed. I want to run again. The simple act of writing that down changed something inside him. It was a small goal, but it was his. And for the first time since the explosion, he didn't feel like his life was over. He still had a path to follow. The physical therapy sessions intensified. Now, it wasn't enough just to walk. He wanted to go further. But progress was slow. With every attempt to quicken his pace, he stumbled. The prosthetics felt strange, uncomfortable. His entire body refused to obey. And every time he fell, the anger came back with a vengeance. This is pointless. I'll never make it. I'm a failure. But then, he remembered the promise he made to himself. I want to run again. And so, he tried again. And again. And again. Time passed. With every new session, he could take firmer steps. Every week, his endurance grew, until one day, the physical therapist said something that made his heart race. "It's time to take your first jog." Brian felt a chill in his stomach. He had been waiting for this moment, but now that it had come, fear took over. What if he fell? What if he could never really run again? He looked at the prosthetics, at the artificial legs that were supposed to replace his own. But then he remembered his legs didn't define who he was. His strength came from within. So he took a deep breath and took his first jog. The feeling was indescribable. At first, it was awkward. The prosthetics felt heavy, the movement stiff. But then something changed. He started to feel the rhythm. His muscle memory kicked in. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the wind on his face. Brian was running, not as fast as before, not as perfect as he would have liked, but he was running. And in that moment, he knew he wasn't a broken man. He was a warrior. He fell soon after, exhausted, gasping for air. But instead of frustration, he started to laugh. The physical therapist approached, smiling. "Congratulations, Brian." He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time since the explosion, he felt proud of himself. But the journey was far from over, because now he wanted more, much more. Running was a victory, but Brian knew his greatest battle was still ahead. Outside the hospital, the world remained the same, but he didn't. The day of his discharge came faster than he expected. When the nurses came to remove the last of the equipment and he received his release papers, he felt a strange mix of emotions. Was he ready for this? He had spent months adjusting to his new reality within the hospital walls. But what about outside? How would he face the stairs? The questions? The forced sympathy? He took a deep breath. There was only one way to find out. The first impact was brutal. The streets seemed louder. The people seemed different. Or maybe it was him who had changed. The first place he visited was his parents' house. His mother tried to hold back her tears when she saw him walk through the door. His father didn't say a word, just gave him a firm handshake and a silent hug. They were happy he was alive. But deep down, Brian knew they didn't know how to treat him now. He didn't blame them. He didn't even know who he was anymore. The following days were tough. He would go out on the street and notice the stares. Some were admiring, others were pitying, and Brian hated the pity. He didn't want to be seen as a poor war veteran who had lost his legs. He wanted to be seen as a strong man. But how could he do that when he still doubted his own strength? A week after his discharge, he received an unexpected invitation. An old Army commander called, asking if he would be willing to speak to young recruits about his experience. The idea caught him off guard. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this," he said. But the commander laughed. Who better to talk about overcoming than someone who's lived it? Brian hesitated. He had never liked being the center of attention, but something inside him told him he needed to try. So he accepted, and he didn't know that this decision would change everything. The talk took place at a military base. He stepped onto the stage and looked at the audience. Young soldiers, some barely out of their teens, were there waiting to hear him. Suddenly, he felt the weight of responsibility. What could he say that really mattered? Then he took a deep breath and began. "Not long ago, I thought my life was over. The recruits were silent, attentive. I lost my legs, but what really destroyed me wasn't that. It was losing who I thought I was. The silence was total. I spent months believing there was nothing left for me. But one day, a 10-year-old boy told me something that changed my life." Brian looked at the audience and said the words that had echoed inside him since that day in the hospital. A hero keeps fighting after they've lost everything. The impact was immediate. Some recruits swallowed hard. Others nodded, absorbing every word. In that moment, Brian realized something. His story wasn't just about him. It could change other lives. And in that instant, he knew what he wanted to do from then on. Brian never imagined that a simple talk could have such an impact. After he finished speaking, the silence was broken by intense applause. Some soldiers stood up, others approached to thank him personally. But what struck him the most was a young recruit who seemed hesitant as he approached. "Sir," he said nervously. "I was thinking about quitting the army." Brian frowned. "Why?" The young man lowered his head. "I lost my brother in combat. Since then, I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep going." Brian was silent for a moment. He knew that pain well. Then he placed a hand on the recruit's shoulder and said, "The pain never goes away, but you can choose what to do with it." The young man looked at him, absorbing every word. "I don't know if I can." Brian smiled. "Neither did I, but the only way to find out is to keep going." The recruit nodded, wiping his eyes. And in that moment, Brian realized something. Maybe his mission wasn't over. It had just changed. The following weeks were intense. Brian's story spread. His speech was shared on social media. People from all over the world started sending messages. War veterans who had lost hope. Young people facing challenges. Parents, mothers, children. Everyone connected with his journey. And for the first time, Brian saw his tragedy transform into something greater. He decided he wouldn't stop. If his story could change lives, he would tell it to the whole world. He started traveling. He gave talks at schools, military academies, and events about overcoming adversity. With every new speech, he realized his voice had power. But more than that, he was helping people find their own strength, and that was more powerful than any medal he had ever received. One day, while reviewing a script for his next talk, he received an unexpected message. It was a video. When he opened it, his heart raced. It was a 10-year-old boy who had visited him in the hospital, now a teenager. In the video, he smiled at the camera. "I don't know if you remember me, but years ago, I visited a veteran in the hospital." Brian held his breath. "I told him he could still be a hero, but really, he was a hero who inspired me." The boy looked straight into the camera. "Thank you for not giving up." Brian's eyes filled with tears. He smiled. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty. He had never lost his mission. He had just found a new way to fulfill it.